Hello and welcome to this LinkedIn Live with myself, Tony Reeves from Ding Learning. Thank you all for joining us today in lunch break. I'm looking forward to a really interesting and stimulating discussion with Chiara Cirillo, Rosie Holmes and Mike Ride, who are all members of the Contemplative Pedagogy Network Steering Group. Currently have about 100 members on the Gistmail list, so it's a growing community. And they are running a conference in September about contemplative pedagogy and all things to do with contemplation in learnings, but more on that later. So over the next 45 minutes, we're going to get into this idea of what is contemplative pedagogy. And because I'm interested in learning design, I'm going to be steering the panel onto a little bit about what are the implications for learning design, how might we design more contemplative activities and experiences into learning, and what are the benefits for learners. So really excited to get stuck into the conversation. So before we start, we really need to define, well, firstly, I want to welcome Chiara, Mike and Rosie. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
And just what to start with is the question, what is contemplative pedagogy? How do you define it? So Rosie, can I come to you first around that? What are we talking about here? What is contemplative pedagogy?
So I would define contemplative pedagogy. It's very broad actually, but one of the key features is that it's about moving from third person approaches. You know, often in academia we have this sort of, we have to write in the third person, it can be very abstract, but actually really intentionally including our first person lived, perhaps even inner experiences of both the educator and the learner. So it's and that can include many things. You know, that can include things like intentionally slowing down, creating more space for reflection, moving away perhaps from this sort of the main focus being on doing, producing, performing, speed, efficiency. And also just cultivating attitudes such as being less judgmental, kindness, discernment, curiosity. Anyone like to add to that?
Yeah, Chiara, can I come to you? Just to add to what Rosie said, what is contemplative pedagogy to you, and how do you define it?
Yes, so I think that I pretty much sort of agree with everything Rosie said, but at the same time, I think that the whole idea around contemplative pedagogy is that it's a little bit of really kind of shy or slightly resisting from definitions in itself. And so obviously for the sake of our conversation, we start from a definition, but that would be a kind of sort of example of what, sort of perhaps, if not sort of we avoid, but we stay quite sort of open with. And so more than an exact definition, I think that I would say that it has all the qualities of awareness and curiosity and openness and sort of intention that the sort of Rosie meant. And there's really this sense of opening up to ways of learning that are beyond the only critical thinking that it's often considered as valid in university. And so with this first person approach, you allow your body, your emotions, your intuitions to be valid forms of learning. And so I think we're familiar with reflection, and somehow reflection is one already sort of quite familiar and confident, at least with our learners we do it. Contemplation is an even more spacious and expanded way of learning.
Thanks, Chiara. That's great, and that's starting to highlight some of the benefits and also the complexities of what this is. And it just strikes me that in a world that's becoming increasingly obsessed with AI and speeding up and how to make things go faster, that there is even more need for this idea of a more embodied contemplative approach to how we think about learning, to sort of slow us down a little bit. Mike, can I come to you and just ask, so what is it that made you, or why did you become interested in the value of contemplation in learning? What caused you to start investigating this area?
Yeah, well, my background actually is in biology, in developmental biology. So as a scientist, you know, I was spending a lot of hours in dark rooms looking down a microscope and counting dots and things like this. And you know, I always felt that the approach to science, whilst obviously it has that idea of the hypothesis and the kind of problem-solving stage, also has this very sort of open, almost phenomenological approach to opening up to the phenomenon that one is studying. And so I began to become very interested sort of way of being and doing science. And that actually led me to Schumacher College, where I learned an awful lot about Goethean science. So Goethe, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, obviously we all know, was a very excellent and prodigious poet. But what some people don't know was that he was actually also a scientist. And during his famous journey through Italy, he did a huge number of very fascinating studies with plants. So he was able to very much intuit the way that plants develop, and that's subsequently been shown to actually be very accurate given modern genetics and developmental biology. So I became very interested in my own sort of first person experience of doing science, and also, you know, I I also became personally interested in mindfulness, and in a previous job, I ended up having a lot of trips to India, and became involved in heartfulness as well. So a big sort of passion of mine in my current role is trying to bring more of the heart into education. And I completely agree with Rosie and Chiara's synopsis of that subjective view of contemplative pedagogy. But there is also a kind of a second person legitimate in terms of the building of the community and the way that people connect within that community through the heart. And certainly, obviously, if we're doing science, you know, the best science these days is very much done within community. And I think there is one thing that I've become very interested is creating more space in curricula, particularly in science, so that students can realize that it's not all about, you know, learning facts, that it is actually about contemplating the phenomena of study.
Thanks, Mike. And there's lots in there to unpack. And firstly, just to say, it's wonderful to hear that, you know, that you're finding ways to bring mindfulness and heartfulness into higher education, and particularly into scientific education, which I imagine I can imagine that raising a few eyebrows in the scientific community. But you know, this is why these concepts are so powerful, because I suppose as we move more into a sort of an environment where obviously content is everywhere, but content is being delivered even more quickly. There's less value in trying to fill students up with knowledge and more value in trying to create spaces to think about learning at a higher level. It's almost driving us towards this higher level. So, Rosie, can I come to you? What would you say the main benefits that a contemplative approach to pedagogy brings to learning? Like, obviously, mindfulness, great, heartfulness, great. But if we actually look at this in terms of learning specifically, what are some of the benefits that we might see in learners and in learning through a more contemplative approach?
Yeah, so one of my, just because it came to my mind as you were all speaking just then, one of my favourite quotes about contemplative pedagogy is from Tobin Hart, and he says, you know, how we know is as important as what we know. And I love that, because it's basically, you know, I was trying to describe it to a friend of mine who teaches guitar. It's like all the stuff around the content is as important, sometimes more important than what you're actually trying to teach. So in terms of the benefits, I think, I mean, they're numerous. And I think particularly in the current sort of crisis around mental health and well-being in students and staff in education, I mean, that is huge. You know, any approach that's more embodied, that more enables learners and educators to be healthier and flourishing is great. And it really does enable that. But I think it's really not limited to that as well. I think, you know, some of the benefits also extend to you know, really simple things, like it really can enable more engagement in the topic. You know, if you're encouraging learners to engage with, why is this meaningful to you? Why is it important to the world? Then you're engaging the mind and the heart in what you're learning. I think, you know, on a simple level, it can also increase focus and attention, both, you know, concentration, but also that more spacious attention, which enables us to make creative links to other things that we know already. but I think, you know, I mean, these are just some of the benefits. There's a lot more that I could mention. Things like connecting to others in our community of practice really supports that. It helps us to connect more to the environment and the wider world, so that isn't this sort of narrow field of study. But also, I think importantly, it can really help with, you know, if you're developing self-awareness, with really starting to uncover some of our own hidden or invisible biases that we might hold. So in terms of, you know, the agendas, and really important agendas around inclusivity and diversity, I think personally I found that contemplative practice and contemplative pedagogy is such a great tool in terms of being able to actually slow down and go, hang on a minute. Why am I habitually doing it like this? What if, you know, how might it impact learners if I did it like this? Or, you know, that sort of thing. So
Thanks, Rosie. I just want to follow on from a couple of points, but just to say, for those listening in and tuning in, do post your questions in the chat as we go through the conversation, and I will absolutely bring them in and put them to our panelists. But yeah, just to follow on from what you were saying there, Rosie, I think that point of how we know is as important as what we know. Also, really seems to speak to the growing crisis in assessment due to AI as well. In terms of, it's not so much it's not that what we know is irrelevant, but if what we know can be very quickly produced automatically, then what we should be focusing on, arguably, is how we know, and making sure that we're being clear that we're assessing how students come to know things and their process, rather than just assessing what they know, which can be very easily automatically produced. And the idea of bias as well, particularly as we're talking about AI, uncovering hidden biases. As we all start to use AI more, our biases influence the prompts we put into AI. So there's a really strong argument there for making ourselves more aware of bias as we start to engage more with some of these technologies.
Yeah.
Chiara, can I come to you around that? So
Yes.
what would you say are some of the main benefits around this contemplative approach to learning?
Yes, I'm actually going to start with it's not just important what the students learn in terms of what and in terms of how, as you both, but in terms of why as well. And so the kind of link is not that I want to dodge the question, but in kind of sort of what brings me very much to sort of contemplative pedagogy is that sort of deep sense of sort of ethical concern, that it is about really sort of allowing, in this slowing down and in the space in which we really make connection, a deep connection with the subject, with others, with a sort of bigger world intended also in that sort of more than human world, but really sort of going down to that meaning. And I think that, again, if we're also talking about, I don't want to say contemplative pedagogy is the answer to everything, but if we're talking about deeper crisis, it's not just a deeper crisis of mental health, but I think also a deeper crisis of meaning and purpose and ethical kind of sort of behavior, that we need our students not to be those brilliant graduates, whatever they're going to be, but to be also really sort of generous and compassionate sort of leaders that not everyone is a leader, but that's sort of, you know, really they're going to do difficult jobs. And so some of the, I would add that. So rather than sort of repeating, because again, I think that I am quite sort of in tune with the things that have been said, really that sort of ethical dimension, quite sort of deep, personal and relationship in a kind of sort of bigger, is extremely. So the self is there, but also the self moves away, sort of in a sense. And that is encouraged in the classroom and outside.
Yeah, again, you highlight this issue of bias, and I've been doing a lot of reading around research in bias, and it's amazing how mindfulness seems to be one of the main ways that we can open up a discussion around our bias. So both around mental health, but also around why we react to certain things in the world, and that mindfulness contemplation is a really powerful way to diffuse those kind of programmed reactions that we're sort of hardwired to respond to. So Mike, can I come to you? When we're looking at redesigning a learning experience, what does this look like in practice? How might you introduce more contemplative practices into a course? What are we looking at here?
Yeah, so to some extent, actually, if you're designing a curriculum, it to some extent it is actually an act of resistance to actually create more space in the curriculum. And so, you know, we have this lovely book, The Slow Professor, for example, which of just slowing down. And one of the criticisms or one of the critiques that one would tend to get with regard to curriculum design, or asking perhaps lecturers to think about their curricula in different ways, is this idea that but I have to get through the material. I have to cover the material. I have to comply to the accreditation body's requirements. But I think that perhaps, if we're being positive about it, one of the good things that's come out of the situation that we have been in with regard to a reassessment of online and blended learning is that to some extent we do have an opportunity to create more space in the classroom to actually engage in these kinds of contemplative activities, through flipped classroom approaches, for example. And I completely agree with you when you talk about this as a major kind of issue with ChatGPT or generative AI and assessment, for example, because creating that space for students to document the processes that they've gone through is really essential. And I would also argue in my own work, I'm my role at the University of Limerick is transformative pedagogy's lead. So I'm primarily actually involved in liaising with staff to ask them to think differently about the way that they teach and the way they put their curricula together. And one of the key things, obviously, is developing a teaching philosophy. And that can actually be very difficult to do when you're faced with a blank page. And so allowing that space for deep reflection for a while, and then encouraging the free writing that goes with that, can be a very valuable way of making or helping to make that tacit knowledge that we can't always express. I think Michael Polanyi talked about, we know more than we can tell. And that's always a major challenge, is to actually make our assumptions and presumptions and habits visible to ourselves. So again, integrating those kinds of reflective activities. I also have an activity where I ask my the to in something called a poetic transcription. So they actually create a poem from a piece of prose they or their partner have written. And again, that's another way of creating space to allow understandings to bubble up. And I even had engineering students doing this in India. So there was a colleague of mine in India who decided that he would get his students to take time to contemplate a manual about a particular piece of equipment. And then his students actually wrote poems about this piece of equipment through simply doing the poetic transcription. So just a couple of examples there of how you can create more space.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Mike. That's great and wonderful to hear you getting engineers to write poems. I think the world needs more of that. We've had a good question in the chat. So the question is, what do people think about the role of remote learning and electronic forms of connection, such as this? Can they be used to facilitate contemplative pedagogy, or does the embodied nature of contemplative pedagogy mean that the electronic means are less suitable? Chiara, can I come to you on that? What do you think around that?
Yes. So I'm sure that people have different views about it, and but I would say that they can sort of be adapted. And I have seen, I suppose that the biggest experiment we had is when we all were forced, at least sort of here in the UK and in most parts of the sort of world, to bring all our teaching online. Sort of exactly. And it is not impossible to use some of those qualities, precisely because contemplative pedagogy, I don't think, is seeking prescriptions, really fixed prescription, but is the fact that it's informed by certain qualities that you can sort of, to a point, sort of translate them to an online environment. Obviously, you need to sort of adapt them to the needs and to the means. But if it is about connection, if it is about sort of slow down, they are not impossible. So So I wouldn't say that they are sort of completely, they cannot be matched.
No, it's a good point.
But
And
there are obviously some sort of added challenge, but even just being in the same room doesn't sort of necessarily, so makes the sort of connection aspect sort of easier.
That's really interesting, actually, because you could think that you would need to be physically present to perform a more embodied pedagogy. But I'm reminded of an experiment that Rosie and I did when I was running a teacher training course, and we did a sort of a 10-minute meditation, didn't we, Rosie, which was fully online. But can you say a little bit about the experience of that, because you were the one sort of guiding the experience there, weren't you?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking as you were speaking, Kiara, that, you know, my experience was as someone who teaches mindfulness and has done quite a bit of online teaching and teaching in person. When it all moved online, I was thinking, oh my gosh, this is never going to work. It's not very embodied. It's all going to be really stiff. And it really wasn't. You know, actually, sometimes it's actually much easier to teach online, which I thought, well, why is that? And I do, you know, I've speculated about how sometimes when people are at home, they're just more relaxed. So perhaps more of themselves are present and they can therefore connect more to the material. I don't know. I mean, that's just me speculating, but I've also noticed that working one-to-one with students, sometimes it works much better online and other times it really doesn't. You know, I think it varies. But I particularly for our community of our network of educators who are interested in pedagogy, the fact that we've been able to meet remotely has allowed it to happen to a large extent, because we're pretty spaced out geographically. And, you know, it's a very relatively small field of people that are trying to connect and grow a community. And the fact that we've been able to meet remotely has been incredibly useful. So,
but we're also looking forward to meet in person.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I'm also really excited.
Very good point. Just while we've got everyone here, I'll just highlight that you are running an event in September, the Contemplative Pedagogy Network. And let me just share the website. Hang on, I'm sharing the wrong thing there. So do you want to say just a little bit about the event that's happening? I'll share the Contemplative Pedagogy Network website so people can find the website there. But Kiara, would you like to say just a little bit about this event that's happening in September, just before we move on to barriers to implementing this?
Yes. So the event will be running from the 4th to the 6th of September. And we called it a symposium. We like the idea of a getting together and so we'll be spending 3 days.
Oh,
we lost
Kira.
Kira.
Mike, do you want to pick up and just say what's going to be happening?
Yeah, well, yes, we start on I think the Monday lunchtime, and we go to the Wednesday lunchtime at Dartington, which is a beautiful estate down in Devon. It's actually, I'm familiar with it because that's where Schumacher is. And so we have, I think, 2 keynote speakers, Joe Trelfer and Louise Livingstone. Louise is very interested in sort of heart-based approaches to education, and Joe has recently completed, I think, a PhD in the area of reflection. So, but it's not all about, you know, the guest speakers. It's very much about the people who are there present, really engaging in open spaces where things that they're very much interested in discussing can emerge. And we're also inviting submissions from attendees through Juice. Thank you, Tony, and also encouraging people to volunteer to give their own short talks on things that are interesting and relevant to them, examples of good practice in contemplative pedagogies. So I don't know if Rosie has anything to add.
No, I think that's pretty comprehensive. I mean, the title of the symposium is Growing Contemplative Pedagogy in Higher Education, Growing Confidence, Creativity and Community. So, you know, one of our really main intentions is to bring people together to encourage courage in each other, you know, because it can take a bit of bravery sometimes to try out some of these contemplative approaches when we're teaching, when we're marking, when we're listening. You know, it it really, really has helped me to be part of a network of other educators where we can share ideas, share practice, encourage one another. So yeah.
That's great. I just wanted to raise awareness. I'll put the link in the chat there for people if you are interested in finding out more about that event. So do check out the Contemplative Pedagogy Network events website, and I'll also share the link to the Slack group. Rosie, thank you for popping that in there. Let me just do that. We've had another question from the chat, which I'd like to put to you all. The question is, how might one set assessments that embody contemplative pedagogy? Students need other stakeholders and need to be confident of reliability and validity. We all know how important assessment is to students. What might contemplative marking criteria look like? That's a great question. Mike, can I come to you around that?
Yeah, I think this is a fundamental question that comes up a lot when we're asking about student reflections, for example. You know, at what level are we able to assess the depth of reflection? And there are actually some extremely good models out there that can enable us to do that. The one that comes to mind is a model by Hatton and Smith. So you're sort of looking at you know, levels of reflection. So for example, descriptive writing, reflective writing, dialogic reflection, and critical reflection. And what we're really trying to do when we want to assess levels of reflection or contemplation, and that's probably an interesting question as well. What is reflection versus contemplation? But you know, again, it goes back to what we were discussing earlier about higher order learning. So you know, we want students to be not only talking about the what of their subject, but this first person narrative, you know, being engaged in the process of learning, the where, when, why, and how questions are the means by which we can all, and that goes for us lecturers as well, reflect on our practice and have our students, you know, gain the ability to reflect at those deeper levels. And there are some, without being too, I mean, obviously rubrics can be restrictive, but there are some very good rubrics and criteria that can allow us to come up with some pretty good ways of assessing. And actually, probably a really interesting way to do this is actually through a combination of self-reflection, self-assessment using those rubrics, as well as potentially using a peer learning or peer assessment approach, where the students have to share their reflections with each other and engage in discussions about the levels of reflection with respect to the rubric. Now, obviously, there are sensitivities where when people are sharing personal experiences, for example, that we'd have to be aware of. But there are very legitimate ways of doing this in terms of assessment.
That's great. And Kiara, would you like to add anything around that, around sort of implications for assessment and bringing more contemplative practices into assessment?
I think that has been sort of pretty much has been sort of pretty much covered. So
that's great. I've shared the link to the Hatton and Smith article in the chat there, Mike, because I think, yeah, this, as I say, there's a lot to unpack here around this, but it's good to highlight some of these practical strategies for how you might implement this. Can I come to some of the barriers? Because, I mean, so far we've talked a lot about the benefits. This, you know, why wouldn't you want to do this? It's great. There's clear benefits around well-being and engagement, but it's not an easy thing to do necessarily. So what are some of the main barriers that might stop someone from implementing more contemplative practices in their teaching? Kiara, do you want to make a start?
Yes. Well, I suppose perhaps the first one is to think that you're really either doing it right or wrong. So the first, perhaps a sort of form of encouragement would be that's yes, sort of don't worry sort of too much. I think that we pretty much sort of insisted on the fact there are a series sort of characteristic, but there isn't a sort of right or wrong. I suppose that another sort of common is this sense of time that colleagues have already really sort of mentioned, this sense of pressure sort of around time. And so that you need to cover a certain amount of sort of material. And then, for example, this pressure towards assessment. And so it's also sort of that one that really often things. So lack of confidence, sense of really sort of lack of time. And another common one is the fact that because you're bringing something new to the class, or sort of relatively less mainstream, sort of in a sense, it is quite common to expect that the students could push back, because this sense of, yes, not sort of feeling confidence with the way you've been studying and learning and so on, can bring some kind of sort of rejection. Also, the fact that they might feel not very rational and therefore not right in the right place with academia. So these are sort of common sort of barriers, and yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Cara. Also, we've had another recommendation in the chat there, which is there's a good model from appreciative inquiry, the ALIVE model. Yes, thanks for sharing that, Jeff. Yeah, inspired by positive psychology. So I think this is the thing. As you dig into this, you'll find that there are quite a few models and frameworks that can guide you around this to ensure that you can maintain academic rigor while still opening up some new sort of spaces for debate. Rosie, what other barriers do you see? Because I know you do a lot of work with courses, but also with individuals around contemplative practices. What other barriers are there, sort of both, I suppose, institutional, but maybe also personal, around sort of opening people up to more contemplative ways of thinking and learning?
Yeah, I think the main barrier that comes to my mind for all of us is just habit. You know, we tend to do things how we've been taught to do them. We tend to teach how we've been taught, we parent how we've been parented, you know. And so that word disruption is really important. I think, like Chiara said, it takes courage and confidence to go, okay, I'm just going to try whatever it might be. It might be that you have 2 minutes of just shared quiet time at the beginning of a lecture. And that can be scary. You know, you don't want to, people might be afraid of coming across a bit woo-woo or a bit different and weird, but actually, you know, my encouragement would be to just try stuff, you know, experiment, see what works. And another point is that it doesn't always have to be explicit. You know, you don't have to always say, right, now we're going to do a contemplative practice, or we're going to do some contemplative pedagogy. It might be that you bring in your own practice to support yourself. I remember Caroline Barrett, who was formed the Contemplative Pedagogy Network, saying that, you know, one of her techniques was that when she was going to give a lecture, she would bring awareness to her body and the feeling of her hand on the door handle as she entered the room, so that she could be more present. You don't need to tell your students that you're doing that. It could be that you model generosity and respect and good listening, you know. So I think, you know, in terms of some of the barriers, yeah, it's not always easy, and it does take courage, but I think to sort of break out of our habitual ways of being can be so fruitful and enjoyable. You know, it can bring a lot of pleasure to the way that we work, which is perhaps not always given its fair due in our line of work.
No, that's very true. A couple of comments in the chat also, just to bring in there. So comment from Rachel, it's a really interesting subject. Is it fair to say that contemplative pedagogy can enhance emotional intelligence, and is there a way to measure an improvement with this? I mean, that is a tricky thing to measure, but it's a great question, because you can, I suppose, yes, you can very easily see how you can make a link between contemplative pedagogy and emotional intelligence. But any sort of thoughts on that, Mike, perhaps, or Chiara, about how you might link these two, or ways of measuring emotional intelligence, or linking it to contemplative pedagogy?
Ooh, that's very interesting. I think the very nature of contemplative pedagogy and creating that space, by definition, allows us, or the students, to get out of our heads, if you'd like to use that kind of cliche. You know, and the very act of doing some sort of contemplative practice or breathing exercise or something like that to bring us into our bodies, by definition, will lead us, or the students, to be much more aware of those kinds of approaches to learning and being. So, for example, I mean, you could say that the word mindfulness, actually, obviously, it has the word mind in it. So to some extent, it's still very heady. And so a guided meditation, which actually brings us down into our heart center, into our bodies at that level, allowing the students to breathe into that, and then opening up a space for discussion about a particular emotive issue, maybe something to do with social justice, or whatever it happens to be within the contexts of the subject area. I think by definition, then we are beginning to sort of teach or help our students to become more compassionate, more empathic, to relate to and learn from the other. If we're thinking about, Emmanuel Levinas, this philosopher who was very interested in the idea of the other, because there is this tendency sort of with contemplation, with mindfulness, to believe that we're all one, which is great. But actually what Levinas says is actually that the value, the ability to gain that empathy is through the recognition of the other as a unique individual to bring to the world, or in the sense of a student bringing something unique to the class. So that would be my approach to this, is to kind of, I guess, go with that sort of Steiner Waldorf idea of head, heart, and hands.
And yeah, and I know it's very talking about a sort of habitual sort of practice or lenses that we put on. Measurement is something that us as educator, and I don't really sort of know sort of what's everyone's sort of background in the chat, and so sort of forgive me, but at least in education and in higher education, in the context where I work and operate, measurement is so intrinsically part of everything that I'm asked to do. But the same way in which sort of the students get a little bit sort of worried about the fact that we sort of bring contemplative pedagogy, well, contemplative pedagogy also gives us as educator an opportunity to consider whether measurement is absolutely sort of necessary. And so I would say that so that's how I am not really sure, or personally, I'm not aware of forms of measurement for emotional intelligence in terms of sort of increase. But I even wonder if my attraction towards contemplative pedagogy has to do with the fact that I do have some forms of resistance to some of those aspects of my work that I have mentioned here, about sort of, performance related and sort of everything at sort of at faster speed and so on. So I haven't answered sort of how exactly sort of the question, but I think I sort of brought it a bit bigger.
It's so interesting, isn't it? This idea of measurement, and there's another comment in the chat there from Jeff. So he agrees with the comment about your comment about pushback, Chiara. He says, I find particularly with undergraduate students, they're sometimes resistant to being asked about their own experience and to reflect deeply. This is probably because it challenges the consumer model of education, which they've come to accept. So I think it's such an important point, Jeff, and ties in very nicely to what Chiara was just saying around this importance of what's driving what. We're so often driven by metrics in higher education, and that's in some ways unavoidable, but it should never be the be all and end all of a learning experience. It shouldn't just be about everything that you can measure. Just because you can measure it doesn't mean that that's the only thing that's important. Another comment in the chat there from Alexandra. He says, absolutely, if we're talking about resistance, then perhaps defying measurement and metrics is part of the process.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, maybe that's really sort of what sort of attracts us. Some people I sort of met and talked, and I also done a little bit of sort of research interviewing some practitioners or colleagues interested in, and often it is a form of resistance towards, yes, a sort of a way of educating that we feel a little bit sort of straitjacket. Yeah, we would like this sense of a more expansive, more sort of deeper way. It's not just the learning in the classroom. I think is the whole concept of higher education, maybe.
Can I just add though, because we were talking about emotional intelligence, and I think, although I think it is generally very difficult to measure something like that, so Tara and I, a fellow colleague, did some interesting work around group work, where we did encourage groups of tutors to just almost teach some of their learners about why is it important to engage in fellow, with fellow group members that I don't want to work with. We have different values, I don't get on with them. What's the value of conflict? And how is it that I can listen even if I don't agree? How is it my work could actually be improved through learning to actively listen and try and compromise? All of those quite subtle things that are quite difficult when you're in your late teens. But when it was used, what we noticed was that there was just less conflict in the group work, and it was more fruitful. So
That's amazing.
I think there are applications where it could be quite subtle, and I would argue absolutely it supports emotional intelligence. Anything that supports self-awareness, listening, empathy, of course, yeah.
And also feeling those emotions in your body. I think, again, the education system is very much about the head, and engaging students in the ability to recognize that actually the feelings that they have within the classroom about particular topics are very valid. So I suppose there's this concept of sort of metacognition, where we have this ability to think about our thinking. I'm not sure if there's something called meta feeling. I don't know.
Well, this is great because it does this idea of I love the word resistance because it tends to mobilize academics. But I mean, I think we are in that sort of area in terms of what are the spaces where we do have agency, and often it is in the classroom. We might not be able to control external factors or even factors within the university, but we do often have control over what happens within the learning experiences that we create. And it does feel like if we're genuinely looking for what a higher education is in this kind of era at the moment, then, as you say, raising that sort of awareness to a higher level of thinking is super important, and arguably is what a higher education should be about. It shouldn't just be about a high level of knowledge about something. It's about a high level of knowledge about ourselves, about others, about how we interact. And I suppose just to give an example of why this is useful, I've currently been designing courses on data analysis, which I know very little about. But one of the interesting things is that the chief thing that's being asked for by employers around these courses is not the data skills, it's how people work effectively with each other. And very quickly get into EDI and neurodiversity and thinking and metacognition and the ability to understand why something's not working, why it matters to someone. And it is all about these higher levels of thinking. So I think there's a huge amount of benefit here that a contemplative approach can bring, both, as you say, at a personal level, at a group level, and also at an institutional level, if you can scale this up. But there's a question in the chat from Naomi, which is, do you encounter pushback from colleagues? Which I imagine is a great, it's a great question to raise. And if so, how do you respond? What do your colleagues think when you talk about contemplative practice? To jump in on that, I can see Mike smiling.
Well, I think it goes back to, I think, Rosie's point earlier, that there is a kind of self-consciousness perhaps, and I think Chiara talked about a lack of confidence that people have to actually implement things. And so even things like bringing students in and saying, right, we're going to have 3 or 4 minutes, 5 minutes of just quiet breathing here, to actually overcome the lack of confidence to actually do that. It can be quite challenging. But in my experience, if you don't always have to couch it in terms of loaded words like mindfulness, or you might sort of say, well, okay, we've all been rushing around, we've all been so busy, let's just sit here for a minute and just kind of land in the room. And that in itself can create space. And I think at sort of more the level of, even with regard to academic meetings, for example, I would like to see more academic meetings begin with a little bit more contemplation and tuning in at the beginning, and also recognizing that actually the ability to actively listen and allow space in meetings or in the classroom is actually very, very valuable. And I think, obviously, if you can provide evidence that this is effective, and I think someone on the chat there was talking about, you know, the evidence from neuroscience that actually these kinds of approaches are beneficial to learning, to communication, as Rosie was saying, to resolving conflict, you know, those kinds of things. But it is a challenge.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, we've had a couple of comments in the chat there. So Leanne says, I'm a scientist and my colleagues are very resistant unless you can give them a specific task to do with students. And do you have any recommendations? I think, as you highlighted, just that sort of grounding in the start of a session there, just a short breathing exercise, just to get everyone in the room, becoming more aware of what's happening with themselves, with each other. And any other sort of suggestions for activities there for sort of like sort of quick mindfulness things to just get people moving in this direction?
Yeah, one thing, if I may, whilst yes, there are lots of things that we can do in the classroom, we should also consider the possibility of taking our students out of the classroom. So, I mean, many university campuses or college campuses are very beautiful, you know. So why not take students outside and go for a contemplative walk or a silent walk? Obviously not every week, but just for example, in order to enable them to discuss a topic, to work through a topic as they move. I've done walks outside the classroom where the first part is I encourage students to talk to each other, and then we might go back via the same route, but the second part has to be in silence. And then we can have this interesting conversation about the different feelings and learnings to be gained from both talking to each other and listening versus that opportunity to be silent as we walk outside of the classroom.
Thanks, Mike. I think that's a great example because, as you say, asking people to sit still and think and breathe is often too much of an ask, but actually getting people to walk, be outside, and maybe to walk in silence is a great way to do something while still being mindful and contemplative. Just conscious of time, we had another good question from the chat there from Jeff. So, Jess, how diverse is the community of educators interested in contemplative pedagogy? As a white middle-class man, I'm often very aware this could be another way to exclude the experience of people with less of a voice. Can contemplative pedagogy have a stance on things like race, class, and gender? What's your experience in that?
So I've just added a link in the chat actually about it's a really excellent book on this about integrating mindfulness into what they call anti-oppression pedagogy. So there's a lot of thinking that's gone into, you know, how can we try and break out of the sort of white middle class, because a lot of contemplative practice is taught in those contexts, and I know a lot of work's been done in the last few years to try and, you know, use the mindful attention to not do that, so to break out of those habits. So I do think, like I was saying earlier, it can actually really support being more mindful of avoiding being, you know, inattentive to issues of race, gender, class. So I would argue it really supports those agendas. But I also think we are trying to sort of open it up. I mean, the group that we have is fairly diverse, I would say, in the network. No, we're not particularly diverse.
Yes, we haven't asked, you know, for any, you know, fill a questionnaire of you. So that is sort of true. But I also sort of know that contemplative pedagogy pretty much sort of started, again, not sort of a movement, but anyway, there's sort of much more sort of greater, longer experience in the US and Canada. And sort of, and in particular, I'm glad that actually you put that reference sort of for us, but quite a lot of sort of work done around not only sort of racial justice and other sort of forms of oppressions, but also very much sort of linked to, particularly with the Canadians, but also to indigenous land and again, so really sort of matching, particularly for these, you know, widest ways of knowing, really kind of sort of supporting other sort of aspects of sort of this case is sort of much more broader. So exactly, I think that sort of because of sort of we don't sort of have sort of direct sort of examples.
Yeah, no, it's a good point,
It
Carol.
has been addressed. Yes.
Yeah, I might just put a couple of links there. Mentioned Bell Hook's work and Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It feels like almost that contemplative pedagogy is a way into that kind of thinking. It's almost the way that opens the door to a more critical view of education, particularly, but also of living and interacting. So I think this is why it feels like there's a lot of valuable work to unpack here in terms of practical strategies to get people from a point of not being contemplative through the door into some of these much more sort of powerful theories of social justice, like Hooks and Freire.
Yeah, and actually, I would say that I would sort of reverse it in the sense that I would say that some of the roots are sort of common, and then contemplative pedagogy goes beyond, because you really realize how, and actually, for example, Berilla's work says that as an activist, you burn out if you don't really kind of sort of open up. So already sort of Hook makes a sort of, not a critique, she loves Freire, but then she says, then I've moved sort of slightly beyond. And often the contemplative pedagogists go back to that type of work as sort of critical, but then open up to the kind of compassionate and others. And I will also try and put a couple of sort of references also of the work of there's somebody who works in Canada, a philosopher I like very much, called Hison Bay, and she's often opening up the conversations also around nature, and so the connection between self, between others, and then sort of third dimension is that of the more than human world, which is sort of incredibly important for us.
If I could just comment on that, there's a wonderful example, I think, from Jeff in the chat about botany students studying grass and really engaging deeply in contemplating nature, and then also Rachel's point about taking something and holding it in the hands and immersing yourself in it. And just to revisit what I was talking about earlier, that approach of Goethe, which is actually a phenomenological approach. He was doing phenomenology before phenomenology was a thing, basically. So he was opening up to nature and allowing nature to speak to him. And interestingly, I did some research with scientists, and I asked them about their approaches in terms of creativity. And a lot of them talked about being immersed with the phenomenon they were studying. And allowing that phenomenon, that thing that they were studying, to speak to them. And in the same breath, they would say, "Don't tell anybody." So I think the kinds of approaches that are described there in the chat are actually very legitimate and valuable ways of enabling students to gain that compassion for and empathy with nature, which of course is so important in our current predicament.
Thank you all. I'm conscious of time, and everyone's probably on their lunch break, so we should probably bring it to a close there. But I'd just like to thank you all for a highly stimulating discussion, opening up all sorts of ways of thinking about not only contemplative pedagogy, but also its impacts on other areas of academic life and our personal lives as well. There's plenty of links in the chat there for people to follow up on. Just to reiterate again that the Contemplative Pedagogy Network is running a symposium in September. The link there is in the chat. You can find out more information on their website. And Rosie's kindly put her email in the chat there for more information, and you've got the link to join the Slack community if you'd like to get involved in some discussions around this. So just like to say, firstly, thank you to our panelists, Rosie Holmes, Mike Ride and Dr. Chiara Cirillo, and a huge thank you to everyone in the chat for sharing your questions, comments, and bringing this event even more to life. So very much looking forward to hopefully seeing you at that event in September, and look out for more from the Contemplative Pedagogy Network over the coming months. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your lunch. You've got about 6 minutes to eat the sandwich.
Well, and thank you, Tony, for inviting us to speak to you all today.
Pleasure. It's
Thanks, Tony.
absolute pleasure. Thank you all. All right.
Thanks, everyone.